right. Good evening, everyone. See, some folks are still joining the Zoom, but we're going to go ahead and get started for tonight. So welcome to In the Adirondack Library. I am Liz Bellier, Public Programs Manager at the Adirondack Experience, the museum on Blue Mountain Lake. The Adirondack Experience Library is the largest, most comprehensive repository of books, manuscripts, maps, and government documents relating to the history of the Adirondacks. Throughout the series, we are excited to bring you inside the library to explore Adirondack life, history, and culture. This series runs October through May, and I hope you all will continue to join us on the first Monday of each month to hear from some fantastic authors based in the Adirondack region. For more information about the books, authors, and the schedule, check out our website, theadkx.org. Our interviewer for tonight and throughout this series is Mitch Tyke, Station Manager of North Country Public Radio, host of Northwards, and recent recipient of the Edward R. Murrow Award. Northwards airs the fourth Friday of each month from 12 to 1 p.m. on NCPR. The weekly episodes feature interviews, on-site recordings, and special features that remind us what makes the North Country such a special and unique place to be. And it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's author, James Appleton. James is coming to us from Lake Placid, and he describes himself as a devoted Adirondack enthusiast. He is a hiking guide, author, and host of the popular podcast, The 46 of 46. His experiences have shaped a deep connection to the Adirondacks, inspiring him to help others experience the same transformative power of this remarkable region. Through his guiding work and storytelling, James aims to help listeners and readers stay connected to the Adirondacks and feel the same sense of joy they receive when passing the iconic "Now entering Adirondack Park" sign from wherever they are, anywhere, anytime. So in just a moment, I will turn it over to James. He will provide an overview of his book, and then we'll shift into the interview portion with Mitch, and we'll wrap up the night with some audience questions. And on that note, we welcome your participation. You can submit your questions through the Q&A feature and also check the chat for some important links. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to James.
Cool. Thanks, Liz. I appreciate that was a nice intro. And hello, Mitch, and hello, everyone who's tuned in. I appreciate you being here. Yeah, it's my first time talking about the book in anything other than just little pieces of content here and there from my podcast. So this will be fun to actually dive deep into what I did, why I did it, and what the book is about. So if you're not familiar, it's called Adirondack Campfire Stories. So the background on this is on the 46 of 46 podcast, I started a series about campfire stories where I just created these fictional stories, or are they fictional, I should say, these fictional stories that are based all around the Adirondack Park to places that hikers and listeners of my podcast would know. So basically some spooky stories set in places that are very familiar. And long story short, these episodes eventually have turned into a book, the very book we're here to talk about tonight, Adirondack Campfire Stories. So that's kind of the background on the book. There's some stories that are based on complete truth, and there are some stories in the book based just on ideas from my own brain. So you kind of get full ends of the spectrum. And then there's also different folklore from the region that's just kind of general folklore that people know about, and then some more deeper dives throughout that you'll find on the internet, or people who grew up here, locals would know about certain stories. Some people might, but overall, I would deem it a spooky, fun read. Not scary, but spooky. But that's kind of the background on this book, and super excited to talk with you about it tonight, Mitch.
And there I am. Fantastic.
There he is.
Well, I'm super excited to talk with you about it as well. And I guess the best way to get the conversation underway is to ask you, you live in the Adirondacks. You spend a lot of time outdoors underneath the stars. What have campfire stories like these meant to you over your years of outdoor living?
Well, I mean, anybody likes a good spooky campfire story, especially here in October, and what I aimed for with these stories, originally were episodes on my podcast, and they're all, you could go to the podcast and listen to me tell the story with sound effects and music and, really bring the story to life. But like everybody loves these spooky stories. So for me, what I wanted to do was, um, the idea originally began when I wanted to put out an episode on Friday the 13th, because I had this idea of like, it'd be cool if there was like these spooky campfire stories that are set in places all over the high peaks and all over the park that people who come here who listen to the podcast know. So I put it out, the very first episode, the first campfire stories. It was a Bigfoot story, and it came out on um, Friday the 13th, March 13th, 2020, which was also the day the world shut down for COVID. So it's very
In case
possible
things weren't spooky enough.
it's very possible that the Adirondack Campfire Stories brought that pain into the world. But yeah, so I just wanted this, these people to have these kind of like fun adventures in their minds when they're in these certain places. So like there's different stories about this, creature that called the Nye Wolf. And I kind of adapted this story from something I read on the internet, and I expanded it and made it big. So now constantly I'll get, messages from people who hiked Nye Mountain saying no signs of the Nye Wolf today, or, they'll send me a picture that say Nye Wolf ? And like, that's exactly what I wanted. I wanted it to be just this fun thing you could think about, when you're out in the high peaks, when you're out hiking. And the book goes far beyond just the high peaks, but that was kind of the basis for what I wanted, because I feel like everybody, when you go out in the woods, like you like that unknown element of it, and the whole, campfire story thing, like spooky stories. I mean, it kind of goes hand in hand with anything in the outdoors.
You mentioned Bigfoot, and I wanted a quote from the beginning of your chapter on Bigfoot in the Adirondacks, because you write, if there was ever a place where a tall, bipedal, scientifically undiscovered creature could exist undetected, the Adirondack Mountains would be the place. What do you think makes the Adirondacks such a perfect place, not just for Bigfoot, but for all of these stories?
Well, I think it's because it's so big and there's such a small population. So obviously there's just so much space. We all know the size of the park compared to like, all the other wildernesses in the United States. So you take that element mixed with the fact that there are some people who live here, there are little towns, but it's mostly just vast wilderness. I think that's really where, I think that's the attraction. And also the same reason that people want to come up here would be the same reason that I would give about why Bigfoot could easily go, undetected. We'll say undetected up here.
How do you make the distinction between scary and spooky? I mean, I gather you have 3 daughters, is that right? I don't know how
Yes,
old they
I
are,
do.
but are they when you tell them a story, what are they thinking in terms of this is spooky versus, I mean, you don't want to keep them up all night, right?
Yeah, I mean, shout out to June, Penny, and Rosemary, who are probably tuned in inside the house right now. Yeah, it's, I mean, spooky versus scary. Like scary to me is like gory and supernatural dark, whereas spooky would be like supernatural Casper, the friendly ghost. It's spooky, it's fun, but it's like, I guess weird. I do think I would say like scary would be more evil, whereas spooky is more like lighthearted, if that makes sense. And that's kind of where I took these stories. Although there is one story in here that would go more on the evil dark thing, but that's actually like based on a story that I actually heard. So I
Well,
just
and I think that the Nye Wolf story, your protagonist comes out of it pretty chewed up.
Yeah, certainly. Well, there's another story. The Faust Lumberjack would be the one that I would call like the darker story in the book. But yeah, the Nye Wolf, that, yeah. I mean, people get attacked. People get, people are that you have to have some sort of like, there's got to be some negative consequences, right, to your actions and to the things that create and cause these creatures, these things that are out there to attack. So you got to, it can't be too soft. It's got to be we have a little give and take there.
Well, and there is definitely a commonality in a lot of these stories that reminds me of, of a lot of spooky movies out there. There are people making some dumb choices.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's funny. Like one of the story, the Nye Wolf Returns, the story that's at the back of the book was basically like, okay, I'm trying to tell a story. I'm trying to I'm trying to get a message across. So what the message of that book, that story is unprepared hikers and what happens to unprepared hikers. So I took, here's what happens to an unprepared hiker, and this represents this, which represents this. And I, molded the story into a campfire story to actually tell a message so that there is a story to take with you when you go out into the woods to be prepared. And then we touch on these things. So it's almost like that some of the stories are fun, education, entertainment, whereas some are just purely education. And then some are like, maybe stay away from this area because problems happen there, like such as the Eagle Cave episode, or not episode, Eagle Cave story.
Well, they, you said it's a Freudian slip, but they do kind of feel like episodes as you read this. I mean, you could easily imagine. I know you've told some or all of these stories on your podcast, but one could easily imagine that this whole book could be a series of episodes.
Yeah, I mean that's how it started. It started with episodes, and then it started with a few episodes of the podcast. I probably had like 4 or 5 of them on the podcast that I had written and just, had those available on the show. And I'm gonna tell you something, it takes a long time to put those episodes out because you got to write the story, you got to rewrite the story, then you got to record it, then all the editing and sound effects and music, and then I got to find the music, and it's a whole thing. So I had these stories, and then when the people from North Country Books reached out to me about, would you be interested in writing some books for us? It was the first book I pitched to them because I said, I have a bunch of stories that I like so much. And I think it would be a fantastic, fun book that, would be fun forever because it's like the stories never go away. Right. So what started as a podcast episodes is what actually turned into the book. So it kind of went backwards in that regard. And then when the book idea came about, I wrote a bunch more for the book, but actually started, as podcast episodes, which is why like my brain defaults to episodes over chapters or stories.
We should talk a little about your podcast, because I imagine there are 2 types of people who have joined us for this event. There are the people who know you already for your podcast and are maybe just finding out about this book or just finding out about this series, and then there are people who are really interested in the series that the Adirondack Experience put together, and maybe they don't know you as well. So
Sure.
talk about how long you've been doing this podcast and what the aim of 46 of 46 is.
Yeah, sure. So the 46 of 46 podcast has been around since March 2019. So yeah, it's been a while now. How it started was I had just finished hiking the 46 high peaks the summer before, and I wanted to tell that story start to finish so that there was one full, complete, like, story start to finish. And you could go online and read blogs, you could do all these things, but like as somebody who is a professional audio person, I said, what if there was a podcast where you could listen to these hikes? You could listen to the 46 high peaks hike. You're going to hike Giant and Rocky Peak Ridge, you're driving up, why not listen to a podcast episode about Giant and Rocky Peak Ridge? So that's where my idea came from. And fun fact, it took me longer to write, record, and edit the first season of the podcast than it took me to actually hike the 46 high peaks. Like, that's how long it took to actually put that season together. And that's what how the podcast started. It's like a documentary series, kind of like chronicling my adventures out in the mountains. And then from there, it just very organically kept going. So I had no intention of continuing the podcast after that, like, first series of here are the high peaks, start to finish. Enjoy. Thank you very much for listening. And then people just kept messaging me asking for more episodes. So I just continued. And then it became like there was a winter series about hiking the Lake Placid 9 mountains. And then it just slowly and organically has evolved and morphed to like then the campfire story episodes. And then, episodes that I call summit sessions that are like you and I talking right now, like that type of podcast style. But the heart and soul of the 46 of 46 podcast is like a documentary style, audio documentary episodes, like chronicling the trails in the mountains. And that's really what the soul of the podcast is about.
You mentioned how long it took you to put that first season together versus how
Yeah.
long it actually took you to do the 46. People, I think, are always amazed at how long it takes to do an audio rich podcast episode.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, so it's the same thing when I hike, if I like go hike the mountain, like I hike the mountain and it's a day. Doing these episodes is like a day of writing and then a day of editing and recording. So I mean, yeah, even episodes take longer than each hike, I have found. So it's a labor of love. It started as a labor of love, and now it's just like a part of my life. And I feel like partly an obligation now to the mountains of the Adirondacks and the people who venture here, because they look to it for their information. They look to it to feel this connection to the park that they don't have. And I grew up here, so like I don't know that kind of need that they have to be back in the blue line. Like I've always been here, so I don't. I never knew, quite frankly, until like honestly, like my early 30s, I never knew that the Adirondacks was like a thing for people. I'm sure plenty of people listening are like, "Oh man, is it a thing?" All right. For me, it was just like it's just where I live. And then upon really diving into what the mountains were, it completely opened up a whole new world to me. Now it doesn't feel like the place I grew up. It's like this totally new spot. But yeah, that's the point of the podcast and how I feel like I now by embarking on wanting to tell this story, I now have an obligation to the mountains to keep doing it, to keep going, despite it taking long time to create these episodes. But when they're done and I listen back to it, I'm like, oh, I'm really glad this exists. That's a fun story. So at least I have that going for me.
So to recreate these hikes up these mountains,
Yeah.
did you have journals that you went back to pull from the detail? Did you hike them again?
Sure.
How did you do it and do it so credibly?
So the very first, for like the first season of the podcast with the 46 high peaks, I had written down, I like bought one of those booklets, where you could just like log your your hike. But I had only made put like a couple, like maybe like one paragraph, just, little things, nothing really. And when I decided to like embark on this little project of mine, I was honestly shocked at how much information, and this was like some of it was 6 months removed and like 46 plus, another 50 other mountains hiked since then. And it was honestly shocking how much I retained when you would just put your mind back in that spot. So, okay, I pulled up to the trailhead. Okay, when I hiked this mountain, this is the trailhead I hiked from. And then I hiked in these. Oh my God, that's right. I passed this person. And it's like crazy how much was in there. And you won't realize it until you put your mind back there. But honestly, like a lot of it, it really did come back to me. And it even shocked me as I'd be writing the story. Like, I can't believe I remember passing this guy and he said this, or I can't believe I remember, eating this sandwich on top of this summit. People love when I talk about the sandwiches that I haven't out there, but it really was just that sort of thing. I just remembered, and it was just as surprising to me as probably it is to anyone listening.
Have you thought of doing a recipe episode?
A sandwich recipe
Yeah,
episode.
exactly.
Good idea. Good idea. I do get pretty in depth with some of the episodes about the food that I'm eating, and I do constantly get feedback from people that they love hearing about the snacks and the sandwiches and the meals after the hikes, because we all know we go hiking so that we can eat something after the hike. But yeah, totally.
Well, talk about let's get back to spooky events and spooky feelings and the book. Yeah, I mean, have you had experiences, out in the vast wilderness that is much of the Adirondacks that either you can't explain or got you to thinking about that served as the genesis for some of these stories?
So I have always had I've never had I've never had a situation out in the woods where I'm like super stressed out and nervous. I've had scenarios where like I'm kind of nervous, but I had to like kind of tune it out because of where I was. And when you're in the Santanoni range at 3:30 in the morning, you're out there no matter what, like you're out there. So you kind of have to just kind of tune it out. But I have thankfully, quite frankly, thankfully not had scenarios that you hear about, you read about, you see about, people talking about, where it's, it completely throws their life in a spiral, thankfully. With that said, I have been fascinated by the subject of Bigfoot for as long as I can remember. So that's kind of probably my the reason where, or like what started, like the gateway into the idea of these like spooky stories that are fun. And the whole point of the book is fun. It's lighthearted, it's fun. It's not like a scary book, but I've always found Bigfoot fascinating because there are these people out here who are all saying like the same things. I'm experiencing the same thing and all over the country. And it's like something's happening out there. So that's kind of what has always been fascinating to me, that subject. I feel like anybody that goes outdoors, like you'll make a Bigfoot joke at some point while you're out there because it's just kind of a part of culture in America.
Well, and I'm going to quote from your book, your Bigfoot chapter again,
Yeah.
because the last line of that of the chapter was what really entertained me. You just write, "Oh, and one last thing: no person on Earth has ever actually mistaken a bipedal ape-like creature for a bear. So let's put that narrative to bed."
I believe
Almost
that.
as
I
Yeah, I
believe
was just
that.
going to say, almost as though you're speaking to the people who are just rolling their eyes and saying, "Oh my God, I'm sure they just saw
It's
bears
just a
out there."
bear. Yeah, it's just a bear. No, I mean, like I said, Bigfoot's one of those subjects where when you jump down the rabbit hole, you don't have to go far down the rabbit hole to see, like, to make you at least go, huh, interesting. When you hear like stories of lifelong hunters who live in the woods and then they go out in the woods and they experience something that they say, I'll never go in the woods again, you immediately know something has happened out there that has caused such a reaction from someone who is, you know, an experienced outdoors person. So to me, I hear stories like that. I'm like, okay, well, something goes on out there. And anyone that's been in the woods, especially in the high peaks, at 4 o'clock in the morning, it's a different place than it is at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It is a different place at that hour. I've been in the Santanoni range in the threes. And I've been on top of Sawtooth Mountain. Wow, now I'm all blanking. Yeah, Sawtooth. I've been on Sawtooth, the high peak. I've been on top of Sawtooth in the dead of night. I think it was like 2:30 in the morning we were up there. It's a different place in the middle of the night than it is during the day. So the woods are just different. So I'm not gonna ever say anyone's story is like that's not real. That didn't happen. To me, it's like I wasn't there. You're affected by it. So who am I to say that you didn't experience X, Y, and Z? So that's how I feel about that's how like Bigfoot has came about. And then from that, these other stories were just like kind of natural progressions. Okay, we did a Bigfoot story. Now let's do a story about this. This is a pretty common thing. All right, let's do that. Let's set it here where it makes sense, where someone might experience that in the high peaks or the Adirondack Park anywhere.
Well, and you do draw on some tall tales that have a lot of truth to them, or some grain of truth to them. Starting with the Lady in the Lake.
Sure,
For people who might not be familiar with that story, I mean, it is well known, certainly
sure.
to people. Certainly, someone who lives in Lake Placid. But that's a story that it doesn't take much imagination to feel just a little creeped out.
Absolutely. So the Lady in the Lake, a woman was, murdered in Lake Placid. Their body was dropped to the bottom of the lake, with weights tied behind her or tied to her, so she like sunk to the bottom. And that's like hardcore Lake Placid folklore, that story. And it's actually there is a book, The Lady in the Lake. That was a must-have in this book because it's actually folklore people are really familiar with. And that's a very believable story. It's like, okay, she was murdered in the lake and now she haunts the lake. It just kind of writes itself at that point.
And then, of course, you have the competing lake monsters, one in Lake Champlain and one in Lake George.
Yes. Yeah. So Lake Champlain Champ, everybody knows that story. So again, so the first half of the book is like the kind of fictional, or are they? Some of them are not fiction. Some of them are not fiction. I'm not going to tell you which ones though. You're gonna have to wonder for yourself. And then then I touch on the more kind of common things, Lady in the Lake or the Lake Champlain Sea Monster. And then my wife actually found the legend of Georgie, the Lake George sea monster. She found that story. Um, there's just like so many fun stories that happen out there. And, whether they're real, whether they're not, the Adirondack elixir, it's like you drink from this lake and you get younger. So who doesn't like that?
Mhm. I had never heard that story, but you write that, for a while there were doctors, or at least one doctor who was ordering, gallons of this stuff and prescribing
Sure.
it to his patients.
Let me tell you something, Mitch, and people give me flack about this, except for the people who run in my kind of like circle. I drink unfiltered Adirondack River water every time I go hiking. I just scoop it out of the river and drink it. I've never been sick, and I'm sure people are calling blasphemy on that, but there is something healing about the river water here in the ADK. And then another story that's like kind of it was more of a nod to the people who grew up in my generation, which was the Mirror Lake Anaconda of 1997. Any person that grew up in Lake Placid so I'm 38, so graduated high school in 2004. So anytime in that kind of ballpark, age-wise, will 1000% remember the summer that there was an anaconda in Mirror Lake. Like, kids, like the stories just spread like wildfire. So, I had to include that in the book because that's what makes these sorts of things fun, are these like tall tales that usually are spread by kids in their imagination. So I think, like it's worth celebrating. You have this imagination, you're creating these things that is it there? You swim a little faster to the docks at the beach that summer. I think I wrote that at the end of the book, but like, though, that's fun. To me, that's fun. Whereas again, there's a difference between like spooky and just straight up like evil, if that makes sense. And I just want it to be known that I don't go the evil route with the book. I go the more spooky fun route.
All right. So for those of us who may have, say, turned 35 in 2004, what was that summer like in Lake Placid as a high school student during the summer of the Anaconda?
I mean, I was so 97 I would have been like middle school, but uh I mean, everybody knew if there was an anaconda. Also, Anaconda, the movie came out, so
Right. I
there's
thought I
that.
was going to
But
say.
every kid that summer knew that there was an anaconda in Mirror Lake. That I would love to know who created that. Who created that story? Like, who's the first kid who said that, and then it just spread. So, for example, my wife is a year younger than me. We didn't know each other until like the end of high school. So this was like early middle school. She knew exactly what I was talking about the anaconda in Mirror Lake. We never knew each other, different grades. So it's just one of those things that just spread like crazy. And it's funny now when you look back on it. And now
Is
that it's in
is
the
it
book, now it's official, right? It's actually like documented now.
is it a spoiler to tell people that it turns out that there was no anaconda in Mirror Lake?
Hey, we've never pulled the snake out of the lake. So the snake could still be in the lake. You never really know.
I guess, yeah, the lack of evidence could be evidence itself of a conspiracy.
Who am I to say that there's not an anaconda in Mirror Lake, Lake Placid?
I just want to take this moment to remind people that if you have some great folklore or some questions for James Appleton or some stories that you'd like to share, drop them into the Q&A and we will get to your questions over the next 20-25 minutes or so. And we would love to hear from you. We've got a nice crowd already watching us. You, in this book, if I remember correctly, kind of set out some guidelines for what makes a good campfire story. What to you is like the ideal setting and the ideal kind of way to tell these stories? I mean, the stories are perfect. I mean, you could bring this book to a campfire
Yep.
and they're short enough stories that you could be reading them. You could go out tonight and read them.
Yeah. And that was the point. Like, I wanted it to be that sort of thing. So I wanted the stories to be like these short reads where, it's a 10-minute read. You can actually just read it start to finish, or, you could read it to your kid at night and just like, okay, let's sit down, read a quick story and then go to bed, start to finish. So my kind of criteria is you have to pick the location first for your story. Where's it going to take place? And typically make it somewhere that because that creates the fun of it when you go back to it. And then you have to kind of create the thing. What is the thing, the antagonist of the story that is going to be causing all of the ruckus? And then you got to figure out like what causes this thing to come about, right? So you got those things, and then you create your story. You have your protagonist, you have your people doing the things in familiar places, and this thing, whether it's a creature, whether it's a thing, whether it's an unknown thing, you never see it. That's kind of the story. But in my opinion, and obviously there's no like right or wrong way to write a campfire story, but to me, what is the most important piece of the equation is the story has to end in like a dissonance. It has to end unresolved, because if you feel like, oh, there was resolve at the end, well, then it's not scary anymore because it's not out there. I need to think in my head, crap, it's still something's still out there. So I think that's the most important piece. But then once you start like kind of going through that cycle, like it's crazy how quickly and you can make up these fun stories right around the campfire as you go. But yeah, the most important piece, it's got to end in this unresolved state so that it's still out there. Dun dun dun.
Right. And the creature still haunts the right, exactly.
Yeah.
We have a question from someone in our audience. Karina wants to know, what is your favorite story to tell?
Definitely I like Bigfoot stories. To me, I find Bigfoot to be the most enjoyable because there is still that like, maybe he's out there, maybe it's out there, maybe it's not, but it's the most believable of the bunch. The whole Bigfoot subject, and the subject is, again, it's something that I've always been a fan of. So for me, in terms of the stories in the book or just stories like that in general, I like the Bigfoot stories. And the Bigfoot stories in this book, I will just tell you, are 100% based on true stories, true accounts. Both of the Bigfoot stories that are in the book. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, yeah, you have there's stuff from the what is the organization called? It's the
BFRO, Bigfoot
Yes.
Field Researchers Organization. Yeah.
This
Yeah,
this is a real organization.
Yeah. No, it's a real organization, all right. But there's multiple Bigfoot stories in the book. One was told to me, one I heard through various ways, and I basically heard the story and I turned it into an actual like narrative story. And then another one was just like straight up first person account, which is kind of unsettling when you hear it, but both are podcast episodes as well. So if you want to hear me actually like tell the story with music and sound effects, and instead of reading bam 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 on a tree knock, you hear actually wood hitting a tree. It's a lot more. It hits a lot harder. Hits a lot harder, Mitch.
There's a story in here that you collaborated with someone
Yep.
on about is it the ghost town of Adirondack?
Yeah, with Diana Gallagher. Fantastic. She's a writer too. So, and yeah, she just shot me an email one day about like having this idea for a story, and I was like, I would love to just like collaborate and write this story with you. So we both kind of came up with the storyline of it, and then just kind of like back and forth, like literally sent it back and forth. It was kind of fun. Unfortunately, I've never met Diana to this day in person, just over emails. But it's actually one of my favorite stories in the book, because it's also of the campfire stories, in terms of the podcast episodes, it's my favorite one for how like the final product turned out. The music was just perfect. And the sound effects, basically it's like a hiker goes to hike at Allen Mountain and takes a turn into the woods and stumbles upon this old abandoned ghost town, and it's this like thriving town. And then yeah, that's kind of the story. Or is it a thriving town? What's there? But
it's very Twilight Zone, I thought.
Yeah, and I'm glad you noticed that, because that's kind of like what the desire was going into it, to paint this town. And telling you, Mitch, if you haven't listened to the podcast episode yet, that will totally bring it to life. And the only reason I say it really brings it to life is because the music I was able to find was just, it gives it like a Tim Burton type of feel with like the sound of it. But yeah,
I was going to ask if you had inspiration for the production of these, and you mentioned Tim Burton, and that's not a bad person to inspire you.
Well, it's Tim Burton. When I wrote that story with Diana and I did the episode, I had this movie Big Fish in my mind, which is a Tim Burton movie. And yeah, really, really hit the nail on the head. And Diana did an absolutely fantastic job helping me bring like the idea to life, and actually like collaborating with me in my kind of weird way of collaborating. I'm very good at like giving direction and just saying, all right, have at it. I'm not like a control freak at all. And I think we actually had a really good back and forth creating that story. And I love it. It's a fantastic story.
We have a question from Anne, who wants to know any Sacandaga stories. I've heard of the family refused to leave when they flooded the lake. On clear water days, you can see the children playing on the swing set and reaching for you as you swim.
All right. I've never heard that story, but there is a one of the Bigfoot stories is called A Scary Night on the Sacandaga. Talking about the Sacandaga River, though, not, I'm guessing you're talking about the Great Sacandaga Lake in like that Northville area. And I'm guessing that's what you're referring to. But no, I've actually not heard that story. Um, family who
But are
refused
the
to
wheels
leave
turning now?
on clear water days, you can see the children playing on the swing set and reaching for you as you swim. Fascinating. You could, I just gave you the how to write the story. So, and write it and shoot it over to me in an email. We'll get it out this October.
I was wondering if any of these stories themselves you've envisioned like exploding and making the story the single story into a book length feature.
Sure. I haven't with these stories. I have stories in my head of that kind of proportion. But with these stories, I wanted it to be fun and simple. But if there was one that, in my opinion, would make that big, the expansive story would be the one we just talked about, the ghost town of Adirondack. To me, that's the story that has the most like legs underneath it to be really big. But great idea, though. Great idea.
Who do you see as your audience, both for the book and for the podcast? Do you imagine that it's people from outside the area who are trying to kind of rekindle their love for the Adirondacks, or do you see it as people who live in this area and this is just something that reflects on the kinds of things that they're doing every weekend or whenever the same way that you do them?
That's a great question that you bring up, Mitch. My audience is 1000% people who do not live in the Adirondack Park. They want that connection with the parks, and they've found that through the podcast, not because I necessarily tried to make it that way. It just became that for them because, again, with the trail episodes, when the podcast first began, you're hearing the sounds of the trail. If I talk about, oh, then we crossed over the Marcy Dam. Now you hear the Marcy Dam, you hear the river. Or it's like, oh, I talk about how windy it is up on the summit of Marcy right now. And then you hear the wind coming in. So it paints this picture, for your ears, of course, it paints this picture, but it allows you to feel like you're out in the woods and on the trail. And the people who live here, like they get to experience it they just go outside, they look up and there are the mountains. So I do definitely know that the audience who listen to the podcast are definitely outside the park. However, in terms of the book, it's pretty universal at that regard. Like it's just like fun, good old stories. And whether you experience them all the time or not, yeah, for the book, it makes sense kind of for anybody at that point. Because if you live here, you'll know a lot of these places, and therefore that adds a lot fun element. If you don't, it still brings you back into the blue line, like in your mind.
I asked you what makes a good campfire story, but I didn't ask you, in your eyes, what makes a good campfire.
Uh, log cabin makes a good campfire. All log cabin. But then once the log cabin to get it started, Mitch, but then eventually once the fire's burning, then you switch over to TP. That's what makes a good campfire.
And a long-lasting campfire.
Yeah, it has to last long. And although most of the time when I'm building a campfire here at my house, I'm just out collecting wood the whole time, and my wife and daughters get to sit by the fire. I'm just constantly collecting wood and keeping the fire going. Then it's fine. As soon as I sit down, it's like everyone's ready to go inside. It's like, all right, I guess we'll just go inside now.
They're all complaining about the mosquitoes by that point.
Yeah, the bugs are bad for sure. Small campfires. There's a small amount of campfire season in the Adirondacks when you're not being destroyed by bugs the whole time, unfortunately.
Speaking of your wife and daughters, did you test market these stories on them?
Not really, actually. My daughters actually haven't read. So they're 10, 5, and 2. So we haven't read them, but maybe we will tonight. Actually, I bet after watching this, June will probably want to hear a story.
Which one are you going to tell?
Actually, probably the Adirondack story, the ghost town. It's a good introduction. It's not dark. It's more like fun and fun.
It does really
fun.
kind of engage your imagination,
Yes, very,
like
yeah, very much so.
you could really, I think, as much as any story in the book, it was the one that I could imagine, like what would this be like to be out hiking and go a little beyond where you thought you were going to go and encounter something you never expected to encounter.
Right through the trees, right? Like you look through the trees, you can kind of picture that moment of doing that and then seeing this like Wizard of Oz style like colorful town through the trees like that. Yeah, that was the desire for it for sure.
Do we have other questions from the audience? Because I know my dog in the other room is trying to ask some questions, but I want to make sure that we weave in questions people might have. While you're thinking, while you folks in the audience are thinking about that, let me ask you this: is there a bucket list of audio stories you're hoping to tell someday that you have not yet gotten to do? Plans for uh, another season, what you might do down the road.
You said plans for stories that I want to tell, like in a book form or in podcast form, or
Podcast form. I mean, is
yeah.
there, things that you've always wanted to, but they've either because there's so much work or you just
Sure.
haven't gotten around to them.
Oh, there's lots of stuff I haven't done that because I just haven't gotten to. I have a whole list of like, I mean, I've got like a dozen podcast episode ideas written on this board above me here. Just got to get to it. But like with my show, I can come up with ideas all day long. It's just getting the time to put them together because they do take a long time because I'd like to take this kind of more creative kind of endeavor with it where it's this story. It's all based in story versus like conversations. Like conversations those are fast episodes. You just have a chat with someone. But I like my background is in the film industry. That's where I've worked since I was 22 years old. So I have that kind of like storytelling, in my blood kind of sense. So there's definitely a few stories that I have in the back of my head. There's even a story for a novel book in the back of my head too that um, I really do hope will one day happen. It's involving the plane crash on Mount Marshall. I don't know if you don't know the story, it just has everything that like a really good Hollywood search and rescue survival movie has, and it's true. It's what happened. So I actually have a lot of vision of creating that one day, if time allows. But that's like the big story that like I'm really into that story, and I would like to tell that story.
You have done at least one and maybe two podcast episodes on that plane crash
On Mount
site.
Marshall, I did one
Yeah.
episode, which was like, in my opinion, is the number one best episode on the podcast, period, called The Miracle on Mount Marshall. Um, yeah, I'd like to take that and just really expand it to an actual book. Basically, for people who don't know, there was a plane crash, and then the DEC had to go find where the plane was, and through like all this information, they ended up being on the wrong mountain, and then they eventually did find him, and the guy had survived, and the rescue was just like it's got everything. It's got everything that you could want in a good story.
So we have a number of questions. One from an anonymous attendee who is just wondering, in the book, is it clear which stories you developed and which ones are based on Adirondack folklore?
No, because what fun would that be if you knew exactly what stories were like based in truth and what stories were not? I want you to be wondering, man, is that out there? That's what I want. And because they all kind of like, well, they're crazy, but like kind of believable. But no, that's crazy. Well, I don't know though. So I can't disclose that information. But in general, you'll kind of know which ones are more believable than the others. But also, again, they're all kind of rooted in this like, well, maybe.
One in the chat here. Marie is wondering what makes the Adirondacks so special in your opinion. I have my own take as a visitor, but since you grew up there, what do you think?
Great question. So when I grew up here, Marie, I could not have cared less about seeing the mountains. You see them every day. You just like every kid, all you do is want to leave the second you are able to leave. Like anyone that grows up in a small town, you just want to leave. So I did, and we eventually ended up back, as many people do. And then over time, um, I eventually was in a place where I could actually like physically go and explore and experience the mountains in a way that I never did before, because in my opinion, hiking sucks when you're not in shape for it and it's hard to do. So when you are suddenly in the right physical shape for it, you now can explore and experience like what this thing that everyone's always been talking about your whole life. And then once I was able to do that, I actually was able to see this is what this is. This is why people come up here. Oh my God, I get it now. So I'm actually like still finding the kind of like what makes it special. But what I have learned over the years, especially from people who, see me as their gateway to the Adirondack Park because they tell me, and thank you for everyone who tells me their story. I don't ask for it, but I love to read your stories. Um, Anytime I'll post on social media, like, what do you think of when, you see like the now entering Adirondack Park sign? I'll get dozens of people that say, I'm home. No matter where they live, I'm home. That's what they'll say because the place, like, and it gives me even chills thinking about like it brings out like the best in people. And it's a very mysterious, it has a mysterious quality. I can't even put my finger on why these mountains do that to people. Like they just bring out the very best in them and they make them feel like they're at home. Because you kind of like go back in time a little bit when you cross over the blue line. Like we're a little behind the times in the Adirondack Park, but that's also part of the charm of it all. And it's, life quiets down when you get here, except if you're on Main Street, Lake Placid in the summer, then it doesn't quiet down. But I think that is what makes it special is it's this place that is bigger than any of us individually. And I say on the podcast a lot, the mountains don't care about you. And it's because they don't care about you. Like they're this big thing. And we have this privilege of getting to experience it, whether the mountains aren't like waiting for us to experience them, but when we have this privilege to experience them, it allows us to kind of put this wilderness like above and beyond us. And I think that's part of the beauty behind it all. And it creates this, it allows people to feel this feeling that they can't seem to articulate, but they know like, oh, I can't tell you why, but it makes me a better version of myself. And to me, that is the special kind of what makes it so special, in my opinion. Hope I answered your question, Marie.
And we're getting some great insight from our colleagues actually at the ADKX, who write the episode "Tempest Fugit" from the X-Files is loosely based on the plane crash at Mount Marshall. Mulder and Scully head to Northville to investigate a suspicious plane crash, but the episode was probably not filmed there, and I think that's right because I think all the episodes were filmed in like Vancouver, weren't they?
It definitely would not have been filmed here. There would be no reason to film, to go on location to film.
We have a question from Scott, who says, I may have missed it, but can you talk about the Great Range Athletes, which I think reflected on your sweatshirt there?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Is that Scott from Great Range Athlete? Great Range Athlete is basically like, so with the podcast, the same way that I wanted to have this story where I could help you experience the high peaks in the mountains where it's like you're coming up to hike these mountains. You're going to hike Cascade and Porter. Listen to an episode on Cascade and Porter. Get your intel while you're driving up. So I always wanted to help people experience the mountains so they can experience that same transformative power that I got from it. So I want other people to experience that too. This is my home. This is where I grew up. Like I want you to experience that magic that I was just talking about with Marie's question. And that's what I did with the podcast. And I have a hiking challenge called the Lake Placid Niner, which is like small mountains to help you get ready for the high peak. So that same concept of like getting you ready so that you can go out and have your own adventure. Maybe it's because I love the movie The Goonies so much. So I just love this idea of adventures. But Great Range Athlete is just another kind of version of that where I just help people get in better physical shape so they can go out and be stronger when they're hiking. So they don't get up to the top of the mountain and want to die. Or they get back to the trailhead feeling like absolute death, or they turn around and they don't even make it back. So Great Range Athlete is this way of me helping you get in better physical fitness, but build strength so that you can actually enjoy the mountains the same way I have, because like I said earlier in the earlier in the conversation, what started when I became like kind of obsessed with the park is when all of a sudden I could actually finally hike mountains and enjoy it, actually enjoy the climb, not just die going up, enjoy the summit for 10 minutes and then die coming down. No, I could enjoy the whole thing. So that's kind of what I do. And Great Range Athlete is a way that I help people do that. So shout out to all of my Great Range athletes who are in my program.
It's kind of a, I don't know, it's remarkable, or maybe a gift that you're able to see the Adirondacks with such fresh eyes, despite having grown up here. I mean,
Yeah.
and I lived about an hour and 15 minutes from the Grand Canyon for a few years, 7 years, and it seems like a similar phenomenon that you sort of don't appreciate it until you realize how much it means to people who don't see it all the time.
Yeah, big time. And also too, for me, so I was playing in a band in my 20s and we were touring around the country. And whenever we would be out west, I'd like Colorado or the Northwest, I'd be looking around like, man, look at these mountains. These are so awesome. Aren't these mountains so awesome? And it's like, dude, you grew up looking at mountains all the time. And yet for some reason, like completely did not care whatsoever. So there was a realization at one point in where it's very much like you don't know what you got till it's gone. And then when you come back, and even then, like I'd see the mountains, like, yeah, they're cool. But it wasn't until that I could physically enjoy them that it completely changed everything. So whether that's hiking mountains, whether that's camping, whether it's fishing, whether it's, you know, mountain biking, whatever it is, like until you actually get out there and find an activity that puts you in the mountains, in the woods, that becomes fun, they're not going to have that same meaning until because yeah, they're nice to look at, right? But like it only goes so far that when they're nice to look at. It's until you immerse yourself inside that it actually will rewire your brain and change how you feel about them and then about the outdoors in general.
We have one more question, unless anybody has any last minute questions here, but I think this brings it all home for us. It's another anonymous question, but this person wants to know, will we be getting any spooky campfire podcast stories this year on your podcast?
Yes, you will. It is October, meaning the October sessions will be in full swing. The October sessions are what I do every October. They're the spooky episodes or the spooky podcasts. Some of them are in this book. Yeah, it's spooky season. So yeah, absolutely. Coming on Fridays to the 46 of 46 podcast.
And so the book is Adirondack Campfire Stories, Tales and Folklore from Inside the Blue Line, and is available in fine bookstores everywhere.
Yes, sir.
And Annie chips in, let's go Team Marcy.
Shout out to you, Annie. I appreciate that. Annie is another Great Range athlete who did one of my Great Range athlete team training programs. So shout out to you, Annie. Annie's from Maryland. She loves the Adirondacks too. So again, it's like people outside the park that have this connection to the park because they just want to be there. So that's why things like this book and things like what you're doing right now by having this virtual, these virtual events, like you allow people who aren't here to for an hour feel like they're inside the blue line. And I think that is ultimately that's the essence that people want. There's only a few people that live here, right? There's gazillions that live outside here that would wish they were here. And I think that's really the beauty of it all.
And it's great because we've just spent the last hour, and you're in your home studio in Lake Placid, and I'm in my home studio in Potsdam, and it's all being facilitated out of Blue Mountain Lake, and we all have managed to spend a virtual hour in the Adirondacks together.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the beauty of it all, for sure.
And Annabelle reminds us that we can all buy the book from the ADKX store, and she's posted the link to the chat, and so people should go there right this very second.
Yes,
but
pick it up from them.
I'm gonna say thank you, James Appleton, and turn things back over to Liz at the ADKX.
Great. Thank you so much, Mitch and James. This was such a great kickoff to the second season of In the Adirondack Library. Perfect for this time of year, which is one of my favorite times of year. So we hope that you'll join us next month, Monday, November 4th, if you want to get your mind off of the impending election for maybe an hour or so. You can hear from author Peter Lorre. He'll be talking about their book, River Up Mountains. For more information and to register for next month's program, you can head on over to theadkx.org/events. And there is still time to visit the Adirondack Experience in person. We are open for one more week with our final day being Monday, October 14th. I have to say the museum grounds look particularly beautiful amidst the fall foliage, so it'd be a great week to come pay us a visit. So all information, including a recording of this program, will be available on our website. And thank you so much again, Mitch and James, and from everyone at home. Thank you for tuning in. And I'm Liz Bellier, and from the Adirondack Experience, thanks so much. Have a great night.